Hello. Here we are, part 1 of Module 7, Qualitative Adaptations and Comprehension. And in this part, we're going to be focusing on modeling. So in this part, you'll be learning what effective modeling looks like in intensive reading interventions, specifically around teaching comprehension, and also how to adapt comprehension instruction to improve instructional modeling. Again, this is going to parallel Module 6, so we can be following the same format. So in our framework of explicit instruction, we're going to be focusing on the modeling component, the I-do component of instruction. That includes really thinking about clear explanations and planned examples of the kinds of strategies that we're going to be introducing and teaching to students. So why are we learning this? Again, like Module 6, we know that students experiencing reading difficulties are not going to discover or figure out these kind of comprehension strategies on their own, because we know that these kind of strategies and skills that good readers use to be successful readers are effectively hidden from students experiencing reading difficulties. Therefore, the whole idea of modeling is that we're trying to let students in on the secret of reading success by making these kind of comprehension strategies explicit. And again, this is even more important for comprehension because comprehension isn't a sort of automatic process. It just doesn't happen by itself. For effective comprehension to happen, it's a very strategic, active process. So there's thinking that's involved. So we have to be kind of very actively thinking about how we're going to construct meaning, how we're going to kind of move through the components of these strategies that we're using, how to focus our attention and our processing on the task. And so we can't just tell students how to do these things. We have to really show them and demonstrate what it's like. We have to kind of walk them through the process of how to actively engage and implement these comprehension strategies. So these are things that just don't happen on their own. We have to make them very clear and explicit and sort of lead students through the process by modeling and demonstrating and showing them how to do these things. So we're going to use the same framework of effective models that we've been using. So for modeling to be effective, we want it to focus on a singular objective. We also want to make sure that we're explaining the strategy with clear, concise, and consistent language. We want to model and demonstrate the comprehension strategy. And probably one of the really key things for comprehension is we want to show the thinking. We want to think out loud to kind of walk students through what we're doing in our heads when we're effectively comprehending what we read, when we're going through the steps of a comprehension strategy. We also want to make sure that we're selecting appropriate examples to model. Examples that are going to work really well as clear demonstrations of the strategy. And then we want to model additional examples using multiple models. So again, with comprehension, we can't just show something one time because comprehending different passages and texts are very different. So we want to show what this looks like across a number of different kinds of passages and a number of different examples. So we're going to start off by talking about, in comprehension instruction, focusing on a singular objective. Today we are going to learn strategies for identifying the main idea and summarizing what we've read. So this is pretty clearly not a singular objective, right? So we have two things going on here. We have identifying the main idea, which is a comprehension strategy, and we also have summarizing, that's a comprehension strategy. So this seems pretty clear and straightforward, right? That we don't want to be introducing multiple comprehension strategies at the same time. But this is also something that we see a lot in schools, which is that we try to introduce too many strategies at one time or too many strategies in a short amount of time. We might say something like the strategy of the day is this, and then the strategy of the day tomorrow is going to be this. Or we'd say, here are the 5 strategies you can use when you're trying to comprehend something. And because, again, these strategies are really complex and have multiple steps, that's introducing too much. We really need to think about focusing objectives on a single strategy or even a part of a strategy. So we don't want to introduce multiple strategies at once. we also want to think about how we're introducing strategies over time. So this says, today we are going to learn story structure, and we see a story map here where we can think about what are the components of a narrative story. There's setting, there's characters, there's a problem, there's action, there's solution, and there's outcomes. So it might seem like this is a singular objective. We're going to learn about this strategy to be able to think about story structure within a narrative text. But really, these are a lot of complex steps that go into this. So probably what we want to do is not introduce a whole strategy at one time, but instead to really think about moving through the components of these types of complex comprehension strategies one component at a time. So we might say, today we're going to learn more about our story map. For the last few days we've been talking about setting, and today we're going to introduce a new part of our story map, which is characters. So this is probably more in the spirit of focusing on a singular objective, which is going through the steps of a strategy very carefully and slowly. Especially for kids with intensive learning needs, each one of the steps of these strategies can be very difficult to learn, and that we want to make sure that we focus on the steps of these strategies long enough so that students are able to master them before moving on to the next one. So this is a better example. So for any kind of strategy that we're talking about for comprehension, we want to think about it the same way. So one of the kinds of strategies that we often teach is how to answer different types of questions. So we can talk about this sometimes as a question-answer relationship. And there's sort of 4 components of this, right? There's 4 different kinds of questions that we can think about that we could answer from text. Right? One is a right there question, one is a think and search, one is an author anew, and one is on my own. So one of the things that we want to be careful here is you could see sometimes that we may think that we should introduce all of these kinds of questions at the same time, when in fact, we really should be focusing on one component at a time. And we have to make these decisions about how we break up these strategies based on understanding the students that we're working with. So for example, right there questions. These are questions where the answer is really easy to find in the reading, and oftentimes the words that are used in the question are actually right there in the sentence where the answer is. But again, even though this is fairly straightforward, this one component of this strategy may involve multiple days of modeling and instruction and practice before moving on to the next components of this larger strategy. So we have to think about these strategies in parts and components, and maybe thinking about an objective would be to learn a part of a strategy at a time before moving on. So this is, again, a better example of focusing on singular objective. So similar to modeling anything, we want to explain and demonstrate with clear, concise, and consistent language. And we also want to model and demonstrate the skill and strategy, and again, show the thinking and think out loud. So if we're talking about clear, concise, and consistent language, when there's multiple steps of a strategy for comprehension, we want to be very clear about how we talk about these steps. So here's an example. We are going to figure out the main idea of a group of sentences. There are 2 steps in thinking of a main idea sentence. First, we name the person in the paragraph. Second, we will tell the main thing that the person did in all the sentences. So again, this is starting off the strategy, which is the main idea, in a very simple way. We'll probably build on this over time, but when we're initially introducing it and modeling it, we're using very clear and consistent language. There's these 2 steps, and each of these steps has very clear and consistent language that we'll use all the time when we're talking about this strategy. Okay, so we're explaining with clear, concise, and consistent language. Then we also want to model or demonstrate the skill and strategy by talking out loud, thinking out loud, showing the thinking. Right? So we would start off with this kind of explanation of the strategy and the steps of the strategy using clear language, and then we would move on to model or demonstrate the strategy. So here's an example. I'm going to read this paragraph out loud to you. Albert Einstein enjoyed sailing. He liked to play the violin, he had fun putting together jigsaw puzzles, he liked riding his bicycle everywhere. Okay, so now it's my turn to come up with the main idea sentence for this paragraph. Albert Einstein enjoyed doing many different things. So what do you think? Is this a positive example or a negative example of modeling or demonstrating the strategy? Am I showing the thinking? If you said no, that's probably right. So the idea here is I'm I'm saying the answer, I'm kind of modeling the answer, but I'm not modeling going through and talking through the steps of the strategy and showing my thinking. What am I thinking as I'm coming up with this main idea sentence? Like how am I going through those steps? So a better example would be something like this. Now it's my turn to come up with a main idea sentence for this paragraph. Okay, first I have to name the person the sentences are all about. That's easy. These sentences are all about Albert Einstein. Okay, now I have to figure out the main thing that the person did in all the sentences, how all the things that Albert Einstein did are related to each other. Okay, let me see. Let's see. I think he enjoyed all of them. So I think that's it. I think the main idea is Albert Einstein enjoyed doing many different things. So you can see here the difference between this type of modeling versus just modeling the answer or just giving an answer. I'm talking through the steps. I'm sort of saying out loud. I'm talking about what I'm thinking in my head. That's what we really want to do here, particularly for comprehension instruction and comprehension modeling. We want to talk through what we're doing to come up with the answer, not just modeling the answer. So this would be a positive example. So the next thing we want to think about is selecting appropriate examples to model. And one of the things that we always want to be careful about is, especially when we're modeling a comprehension strategy for the first time, we want to show how it works with passages and with text that's really going to be a good example of how it's going to work. Sometimes we kind of fall back on this idea that we'll just use whatever book that we're reading at the time to model a comprehension strategy. And sometimes that backfires because the passage from the book that you're reading at that time may not be a good example where the strategy works really well. Might not work that well. So instead we want to be very careful in choosing paragraphs, and sometimes they may seem a little artificial at first, but when we're initially modeling, we really want to make sure that the passage or the text that we're using to model is going to work really well for the strategy the way we're teaching it. So for example, when we're using this passage on Albert Einstein, we need to have a person that's in the paragraph. So this is very clearly about one person, Albert Einstein. And then we have to tell the main thing that the person did in all the sentences. So this is a good example. We can see that he does all these different things. So it's pretty clear that the main thing that the person did in all the sentences is that he enjoyed doing lots of different things. It's very easy to kind of see how the steps of this strategy apply to finding the main idea for this paragraph. Right? So this is a good example to model. Okay, let's look at this one. When Benjamin Banneker was 21, he took apart a pocket watch to see how it worked. He built a clock entirely out of wood, carving all the gears by hand. He also built the first American-made striking clock. So let's think about, do you think this is a good example or not for modeling this particular strategy? I would say yes. Why? First, we know that there's a person in the paragraph, and there's one person that's very clearly about Benjamin Banneker. And second, is there a main thing that we can say that the person did in all the sentences? All of these are about kind of making clocks or building clocks. So it's pretty easy to come up with that the thing that the person did in all the sentences is make clocks. So that would be easy to kind of show how we can use this strategy to come up with the main idea of this paragraph. So let's look at one more. Blue whales are marine mammals. They can be 90 feet long and weigh 100 tons. Blue whales are now endangered, and people have written laws to protect these majestic creatures. So what do you think? Is this would be a good example to model for this strategy? So to me, this feels like not a great example to model. One, who's the person in the paragraph? Well, this paragraph doesn't have a person, right? There's an animal. And eventually, as we're expanding this main idea strategy, we'll talk about how it doesn't have to be a person. It can be an animal or a thing. But right now, if we're saying that the strategy is that we name the person in the paragraph, there isn't a person in this paragraph, right? So this is a little bit confusing to see how the strategy works. The second thing is it's hard to kind of come up with what's consistent about all these sentences about whales, right? One of them is that they're kind of big, another one is that they're endangered, another one is that people have written laws to protect whales, and so it would be hard to come up with a sentence that tells about what happens in all these sentences, right? So it would be something like the main idea would be, whales are mammals that are big and endangered and partially protected. Which isn't really a good main idea sentence. So if we kind of tried to use this paragraph as an example to model, it wouldn't be a good illustration of how to use this strategy. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is use our framework of effective models for evaluating whether this lesson incorporates these principles or not. So what I want you to do is stop the video, and then you can read this lesson, which is in your workbook, and go through the checklist, just the checklist for effective models, not the other components, and see whether you think this example of teaching inferencing follows the components that we've talked about here for effective models. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this lesson and whether or not it meets these principles of effective models. Okay, so the first principle is, does this focus on a singular objective? And it says it does, right? Making inferences. Making inferences is a really difficult strategy, although I think we could consider that to be a singular objective if we're doing it the right way. We could be thinking about kind of breaking this into multiple lessons to get at the different parts of making inferences, but I would say for the most part that this would be a strategy that would focus on a singular objective. Okay, the next component is explain with clear, concise, and consistent language. So this is the part here where talking about explaining and describing the strategy. So what it says is explain that as they read, students can think about what they already know from their own lives and what is in the story to make inferences about things or figure out what the author does not say directly. In a sense, that's a pretty good explanation of what an inference is. But we might sort of say that, this is more kind of adult language for understanding what an inference is and maybe not targeted towards students as much. And it's hard to know then how they're going to maybe use this language consistently over time to talk about here's what you do when you make an inference. So I might not give this, I would say that this although has some clarity to it, that it might not be as clear as we would want for working with students. Okay, the next one, model or demonstrate the skill or strategy. So here's a section here that says modeling. So what the person says, or the teacher says is, I know that many people use recipes or written directions when they cook. In the picture, I see that Rabbit is reading a cookbook. Cookbooks have recipes in them, so I can make the inference that Rabbit will use a recipe to make the cake. So when we think about it, this is definitely the teacher is sort of thinking aloud about how they're going about making this inference. The question is here is, do we think this is enough? Do we think this is clear enough? Are we modeling the steps enough to really make it clear to students exactly what we're doing and what we're expecting them to do? So this one may be a little iffy and could go maybe a couple different ways. And then finally, selecting appropriate examples to model. It seems like that, especially for kids who are younger, that we can kind of use information from the text to make an inference, so that there are some pictures that we're using. So it's kind of hard to tell without seeing it, but we'll assume that this works pretty well and that this is text that makes it pretty clear that we can use an inference to answer this question. And finally, model multiple examples. This was the underline here for that Rabbit is reading a cookbook. So this we can say that again, that maybe this is a pretty good example because that's the evidence that we're going to use to make the inference. That's not stated directly, but we can make an inference by, if we see a cookbook, then we can use what we know about cookbooks to make an inference. And then finally, using multiple models, we see that right away they jump to practice and apply, remind children to make inferences if they have trouble understanding words or ideas as they read. So we're only modeling one example here, so it doesn't meet the criteria for modeling multiple examples. So we could think a little bit about how we might adapt or revise this lesson to make it more supportive. And again, we don't have a lot of space here in this kind of setting, so it's a little bit artificial. But there's definitely some things that we could do, quick things that we can do that could make this more effective and to make it more in alignment with our principles of effective modeling. So here's a slightly revised lesson, adapted lesson to try to address some of those things. Okay, so the explanation is that sometimes the answer to a question is right there in the story. Sometimes, however, the answer isn't right there and you have to look and think a little harder. For some questions, you have to think about what you already know in your head to get the answer. This is called making an inference. Right, so this is change the wording a little bit to try to make it be a little clearer and a little more coherent for students. So this idea that sometimes an answer isn't right there, sometimes you have to look and think a little harder. And what you have to think about is what you already know in your head. Right, so this is a little bit more student-friendly language that we can use consistently when we're talking about how to make an inference. Then how are we going to model or demonstrate the skill or strategy? So we've added a little bit here to the modeling. So the teacher says, I looked back in the story, but the answer to this question isn't right there. So I need to look and think a little harder. I'm going to think about what I already know in my head. Right, so here again is linking back to those very clear and specific steps of the strategy. Right, the answer isn't right there. I have to look and think a little harder. I have to think about what I know in my head. So then it goes to what it was doing before. I know that many people use recipes or written directions when they cook. And so in the picture, I see that Rabbit is reading a cookbook, and cookbooks have recipes in them. So I can make the inference that Rabbit will use a recipe to make the cake. And then at the end, it says model answering 2 more questions and using inferences and thinking aloud. So that we're not just going to stop there, but we're also going to model 2 more times using the same kind of approach with different questions in this passage. So we didn't do a lot here to change this, but they're very important, critical kind of changes that goes along with how we want to make models more effective. We want to really think that we're using clear, concise, and consistent language that's appropriate for kids. And then probably most importantly, we really want to walk through and model and think aloud through the modeling of the strategy and do that multiple times with multiple examples. Okay. We're on now to our next activity, which you are going to be evaluating a video. So you're going to watch a short portion of this video. And again, you're going to see some things around practice and feedback and other things, but I want you to focus particularly on this video this time on whether you're seeing these features of effective models. So you're going to look at this checklist in your workbook. And as you watch this video segment, see whether or not you see examples of these features of effective models in the video as you watch it. And then we'll come back and talk a little bit about what you saw.
Knowing the main idea of what we read helps us to better understand and remember what we read. So when we are going to find out the main idea of a picture or a story, we can follow 3 steps. I've written them up on our chart. First step to determining the main idea is to identify the most important who or what in that photo or story. Who or what is it mostly about? Step number 2 is to identify the most important information about the who or what. So we found who or what the story or photo is mostly about. Now we need to know the information about that who or what. And step number 3 is to write or say that information in 1 short sentence. We're going to try and say in 10 words or less. So we're going to practice today using a photo. So I want us to look at step number 1. Step number 1 is to identify the most important who or what in this photo. Come on your knee. You think you found the most important who or what in this photo? Owen?
The girl in the white dress.
Why do you think the girl in the white dress is the most important who or what?
Because she's the only one that's wearing the white dress.
Step number 2 is to identify the most important information about the who or what. I'm going to give you some think time. So we said the most important who or what is the girl in the white dress. I'm on your knee if you'd like to share the most important information about the who or what. Aiden?
The most important thing about the who and what is the girl in the white dress getting married.
Who thinks they can help us? Right now we're going to say this information in one short sentence using 10 words or less. That's step number 3. Rachel?
The girl in the white dress is getting married.
Girl in the white dress is getting married. Go ahead and put a thumb on your head if you agree. All right. Now we're going to practice with a different photo, and you're going to talk to your partner about it. I'm going to give you some think time before you turn and talk to your partner. So here's our next photo.
All right, welcome back. So this was a video of a teacher working with a group of students on teaching main idea. It's sort of similar to the main idea example we did before, but a little bit different. But again, kind of very similar. So let's talk about whether or not these met the criteria. One is that focus on a singular objective. And so the objective here is teaching a strategy for main idea. And there's the 3 steps, and she introduces all 3 steps together. To me, that seems appropriate. Again, you may have students where it really feels like you should only kind of do one of these steps at a time and kind of go through step 1 for 1 day or 2 days and then step 2 the next day. So that's kind of based on your understanding of what your students need. So the second criteria is explain with clear, concise, and consistent language. So she had very clear steps of what this strategy was. The main who or what, what they did, and then kind of making that into a short sentence with 10 words or less. Right? So there was a very clear, concise, and consistent language used with the steps of the strategy. She actually had it written up on a piece of chart paper, and she kind of talked about each one at a time and talked about what that means. So I think this would be as a really effective and a good example of using clear, consistent language and really talking about here are the very specific steps of the strategy. So the next component is modeling or demonstrating the skill or strategy, showing the thinking. So this is the place where we don't really see this in this example. She's very good at kind of explaining the strategy, but then she kind of goes directly to having the students practice using the strategy to come up with the main idea. So we would say here that this particular example isn't showing or demonstrating the skill or strategy. She's not really modeling or showing the thinking. It may be that students already have been introduced to this before, but maybe not. We don't know. So what we would say is we would really hope that she would go through and, with the picture or with something else, talk through how she goes through those steps to come up with the main idea. So that would be a place that we would want to adapt this lesson if we were teaching it. Select appropriate examples to model. I think this was interesting because she uses a picture, right, instead of a text, which is showing that we can do something like this with a very scaffolded kind of approach. It's not making students have to read something. It's not even reading text aloud. She's sort of using a picture to kind of as an initial example. And that's a good example of really trying to do something simple where it's very understandable so that students will be able to kind of understand how the strategy would work. And finally, does she model additional examples? She doesn't. She goes directly on to another example, but this is one that the students are going to be doing in pairs. So she doesn't kind of talk through a second example. In fact, she doesn't really model that first example either. So this is a very good example of some of the components of modeling, particularly the clear and consistent language and thinking about an appropriate example to use, but also doesn't meet the criteria in a couple of other ways. Most importantly, modeling or demonstrating this strategy by showing the thinking and thinking out loud and doing that with multiple examples. Okay, so let's try one more. And this is going to be another video where a teacher is introducing and teaching a comprehension strategy for predicting. So again, stop the video here and use your checklist to evaluate whether or not this example is showing effective modeling.
Another goal that we have today as we read this story is that we are going to make predictions. And a prediction is when you kind of make a little guess about what's going to happen next.
So maybe if I looked outside and I saw really dark clouds in the sky, I might predict or guess that it's going to rain. We can also do that when we read stories. As we read stories, we can stop and think about what might happen next and make a little guess or a prediction. When I say turn and talk, you're going to say the words to your partner. I predict that, and then say what you think is going to happen. I predict that.
Okay. This was a video of a teacher working with a group of younger students on predicting. So let's see what you thought about this video. First, focusing on a singular objective. She's focusing on predicting within a storybook. So again, this seems like it's focusing on a singular objective, teaching students how to make predictions as they listen to a story. Explain with clear, concise, consistent language. Again, you may have some different thoughts about this, but I thought that she did a really good job of using consistent language when she's talking about a prediction. She says it's like making a little guess about what's going to happen next, and that's predicting. And she says that a couple times. It's like making a guess, a little guess about what's going to happen next. And I think that's kind of appropriate language to use with younger students. And she uses that consistently. When she talks about predicting, that's how she talks about it. All right, so the next criteria is whether is modeling or demonstrating the strategy, and especially showing the thinking. So what she does here is she does a nice model of how she might predict what the weather's going to be like. If she looks out the window, and if it's gray clouds, and she might predict that it's going to rain. So it's a kind of a nice way to model or demonstrate something in a kind of real world application that might be understandable to students. So that's a nice thing that she does. But similar to the video we saw before, what she doesn't do is model using this strategy with the text in the book that she's going to ask the students to make predictions with. So she doesn't say, let's look at our book and I'll show you how I might make a prediction about what's going to happen next. I'm going to make a little guess about what happens next. And that would also give her the opportunities to sort of talk about what are the clues or the evidence that she's using to make those predictions. That's a piece that maybe is missing here a little bit. It's one thing to sort of say, guess what's coming next, but she didn't really kind of talk about how you decide or make that guess, how you kind of look for evidence or look for clues that might give you a sense of what's coming next. And that would be a really great place to do that through modeling or thinking aloud. And she doesn't do that here. She explains it really carefully again, but then she goes right to giving students an opportunity to make predictions. Select appropriate examples to model. We don't know for sure, but it seems like she's picked a book where there are clues and some things where the kids are going to be able to predict what happens next, but we're not really sure about that. And then finally, model additional examples. She doesn't do that. She moves kind of directly into the practice opportunities where she's giving students opportunities to practice. So again, this is pretty similar to the example that we saw before. And probably is a pretty good representation of what we see a lot in schools, or what you get a lot when you're implementing a lesson, which is that there's probably there's often a very clear strategy with very clear steps that you can explain very carefully, that it has good examples of what kids are going to practice on. But it doesn't really go through that step of the teacher modeling first, really thinking aloud about what's happening. Or if they do, it's a quick model and there's not multiple examples. So I think a really important thing that we can kind of take away from these two videos is this idea that especially when we're working with kids with really significant learning difficulties or disabilities that require the most supportive instruction and intervention possible, that we don't want to leave out that modeling step. We really want to show students how we're doing this, what we're thinking in our head as we're moving through the steps of these things. And for a lot of kids, that's going to be the real difference about whether or not they learn this or not. So these two examples are really great around the clear and consistent wording, but they could use some additional adaptations for modeling, specifically for the kids that we're talking about here. Okay, so that concludes the first part of Module 7. And the next component is going to continue on, where we'll be talking about practice opportunities within comprehension instruction.